Hello, everybody. Welcome to International Podcast Day 2018. It is great to be broadcasting around the world. This year, we are celebrating 40 different podcasters from 16 countries around the world. Make sure you guys are out there using hashtag International Podcast Day, sharing the word, getting out there as a listener or a podcaster. Before I get started on this session, I have Hiba Fisher. She's from the United Arab Emirates, and I have some interesting. We did something interesting with this session. So before I get into that, I did want to thank our sponsors for our events. Without, of course, their sponsorships, this event would not be possible, and of course, without the volunteer help from all of our podcasters out there as well. So we'd like to thank our 2018 sponsors. Learn more at internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors. Our platinum sponsor again this year, 3 years running, is Blueberry. They are a full-service podcasting company providing podcasting hosting, stats, and advertising opportunities. You can find more at blueberry.com. And to our great silver sponsors, repurpose.io. They automatically convert your audio podcast into engaging videos and upload them to YouTube, Facebook, and other social media channels. And also Podcast Success Academy. This is a free academy that you can get access to by heading over to podcastsuccessacademy.com. And what they do is they teach podcasters the skills that no one told them that they needed to succeed. So it's a resource packed community, tools, workshops, tutorials, courses, so much more. We definitely encourage you to head over to internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors to take part in that. Well, the reason I was talking about the uniqueness of Hiba Fisher with the United Arab Emirates, she is actually not going to be joining us live broadcasting. She will be in the chat feature. And so when I reached out to her originally, I mentioned, "Hey, we do this live broadcast. We'd love to have you." And she goes, "It all depends on what sort of video platform that you're going to be using, Dave." And I was like, this will be interesting." And I asked why, and because unbeknownst to me, that there had been a new added obstacle in the United Arab Emirates where the residents there don't have access to a lot of voice over IP services and providers like we use Hangouts here to present this. And so it was a newly added obstacle in the UAE, and it's been coming for about a year. And she says, in the earlier days they used to interview using Skype, but her understanding is that the ban on VoIP services is that the government wants to monitor communications, and they haven't reached an agreement with VoIP providers to do so. Ergo, there's no opportunity for her to join us live via Google Hangouts or YouTube Live. So what we did is we worked with Hiba, and she put together about a 25-minute video for us to kind of share where she's at um, regarding building the Middle East podcasting scene really for the first time. And to give a little background, Hiba Fisher, she's a podcaster with Kerning Cultures. She is also a serial entrepreneur and journalist. Her first two startups were microfinance and a small business education company here in the United States and in the Gulf. And then she started to wonder why the media that was surrounding her wasn't capturing the kinds of stories she actually cared about. These stories would be the human-centered stories that would inspire, make her cry, and reflect on how the world works as it does. So she co-founded in 2015 Kerning Cultures to build a premier Middle East podcast network. And so what we're going to hear from her is, how do you build a podcast market? How do you build a podcast scene in one that is in such its infancy? So, whereas markets like here in the United States, where there's hundreds and hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands, active shows, in the Middle East, they're calculated there's about 150 active podcasts on record, and most of them have cropped up in the past year alone. So, Kerning Cultures, her project, is one of the few Middle East podcast companies, and as such, they're really defining the landscape of what's going on right there. So, what she's going to do, she's going to share the woes and opportunities they faced, what it takes to build a new user behavior when digital audio is not mainstream. And of course, the potential to see where the podcast will be going across the Middle East and also across North Africa. So, Hiba will be in the chat room if you have any questions. But for right now, I'm going to stream her session and hope you enjoy it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hebah Fisher, and I'm one of the co-founders of a Middle East podcast network called Kerning Cultures. I'm coming to you from Dubai. Our flagship show under this network has been called by The Guardian as the This American Life of the Middle East because of its narrative style. And we've told the kinds of stories like a man's mission to revive specialty coffee in Yemen for global export amidst the current war, or another episode we called Her Side of the Story, which featured the non-narrated stories of two Arab women describing the aftermath of their divorce. With Kerning Cultures, we tell the kinds of stories we actually care about, in contrast to, unfortunately, a lot of the mainstream media across our region that has stopped speaking to its young people. So we produce stories for ourselves, these beautifully produced narratives that by the end of an episode, you feel like you've just had an intimate conversation with the characters and you're looking at your world with a little more fullness. So today I want to share with you what our experience has been podcasting in the Middle East and what it's been like building a company in a new media space for a market that is only just starting to listen to podcasts. As a bit of background about us and the context of our experience, we started producing episodes for Kerning Cultures 3 years ago, just a few days ago this month, actually. We just had our anniversary on the 25th. And while it's hard to get an accurate sense of what the podcasting landscape looks like, since there aren't many directories or any sort of comprehensive data available for the Middle East podcast scene, we've been doing our own internal research. And according to what we found, Kerning Cultures is one of 3 companies that are commercially focused podcast companies from the Middle East. We're in an ecosystem of about 200 active shows, mainly in Arabic or English. And as a comparison, the number of active podcasts in the US are anywhere between, I've heard about 350,000 to 500,000 shows. So our 200 Middle East podcast shows it's a really tiny number, like super tiny, but growing very fast. We're seeing maybe 5 to 10 new shows each week, and we were stuck at about 100 shows for the past 2 years. So there's really been a lot of momentum in the past couple of months. In reflection of this growth, actually, the first ever Middle East podcast forum was held yesterday here in Dubai, and it was a gathering of more than 50 podcast shows from the UAE and Saudi, with nearly 200 people registered. There should be recordings of that forum online, by the way. So if you just Google Middle East Podcast Forum, I'm sure you'll find some more information if you're interested. And so when we started producing for Kerning Cultures 3 years ago, it was myself and our very talented sound designer, Ramzi Bashur, and we were copying what we heard from our favorite Western podcasts. For me, that was Radiolab. And that's what we wanted to recreate with our show. So these sound-rich, narrative-driven stories. Ramzi was and is an original composer and filmmaker, and he brought his film scoring experience to this new audio world of ours. That as a skill set was absolutely essential because the kind of sound designers we have in the region are more experienced with audio production from a technical standpoint. So fixing levels, correcting some mistakes, what have you. This idea of a narrative sound-rich podcast was hard for us starting out to even articulate properly what it was we were looking for in a sound designer, let alone, and for the talent we were talking to as we were building our team, that as a style was all new. But the experience existed in the film world. And for the most part, at least in our experience, it exists in Lebanon. To this day, all of our sound designers are Lebanese, and they're exceptionally talented humans. A shout out here to Mohammed and Fadi alongside of Ramzi. So when we started, we were a small team, bootstrapping. My co-founder, Razana Zayani, who joined me shortly after we launched our first episodes, she and I poured our savings into Kerning Cultures, and we were learning what we were doing as we went along. As such, there were a lot of things we did wrong, of course. For example, we had heard that it was a good idea to hold off until launching our show, till launching our first show, till we had a pipeline of episodes. So we did that. We had 4 ready to go, and then we launched, released 1 episode a week, but way underestimated how long it took to make episodes 5 and 6 and 7. And so we released 4 episodes once a week and then basically went silent for months as we were producing the other episodes. So we definitely didn't ride the wave of momentum of consistent production at the beginning. And I think, especially in a new market, that did not help us. Now, there was also the challenge of getting guests. When we asked for interviews, many would reply back with, "Is this video?" I think podcasts was synonymous with broadcast, which in many people's minds was video. What we found, though, was that guests would actually be more comfortable because it was only audio. We were able to speak to women who would have never agreed to a video interview, for example. But because it was only audio, they were a lot more comfortable sharing their stories or experiences with us. There were also instances where, because it was audio only, we had a lot more flexibility in things like preserving anonymity of our guests. Sometimes we'd speak about sensitive issues, and over the years, we've had a few requests to alter a guest's voice. That's an easy fix for us to do in post, and yet you still feel as a listener like you can connect with the character and their stories. Whereas that kind of a fix in video, for example, if you were to blur somebody's face, would, in my opinion, estrange that connection. With audio only, we don't have that issue. So even though we certainly had to explain what a podcast was and what the interview would be, and it's audio only to our first guests, there were a lot of things that only audio did that sort of helped us very much in our storytelling, and to this day. Now, while we were figuring out our steady production of high quality stories, we were also trying to grow awareness about podcasting in general. So many of our conversations here in Dubai would start with, "Have you ever heard of a podcast?" And I would never make an assumption walking into a room doing a talk. I often would start with, "Does anybody know what a podcast is?" and sort of level the playing field to start. And it became my habit to ask people to whip out their phones so I could show them how to use that purple podcast app that they probably did not touch since they first bought their phone, or if they had Android, how to open up SoundCloud, which is a popular app here, and search for Kerning Cultures. SoundCloud is huge here, is what we found. That's all changing with the proliferation of more apps for Android for podcasts. But here in the Middle East, because Android is more popular than Apple, making sure that our shows were everywhere our listeners were was key. That meant getting on absolutely every Android and Apple supported podcast app we could. So, in addition to honing our craft as storytellers and learning how to produce compelling stories, in other words, production itself, our challenge in Dubai is to actually grow the podcast listening behavior in general. In other words, grow the audience for our stories. And not just for our stories, but for all podcasts across the board. It's like a rising tide lifts all boats mentality. And I really believe that, hence talks like this. So we came up with an idea early on as a way to help grow the behavior of listening to podcasts. Everyone has a phone here. The Gulf countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia in particular have the highest smartphone penetration rates in the entire world. Most people have 2 to 3 phones that they love to stack on the table at dinner. So it wasn't a question of access to the technology to listen to podcasts. It was a matter of the behavior of listening to podcasts and this new thing of listening to on-demand audio that wasn't music. Radio is mainstream here. Dubai actually has the highest frequency of radio stations per capita above anywhere else in the Middle East. And already radio reaches more households in the Middle East and North Africa than television. So listening as a behavior is mainstream and common. The issue was this new thing of on-demand listening from something like your phone, and not to music or the Quran, but to stories. which, yes, we had some of on our radios. There were some programs that I personally enjoyed to listen to, or there would be seasons of content like during Ramadan. You'd hear these fiction series air where they'd hire voice actors, and it was like a little TV show played out on the radio, day one, day two, which was wonderful. But to translate that to on demand from your phone, wherever you want, whenever you want, was a whole nother thing. It still is, to be honest. We're still figuring out effective ways to grow this as a habit of listening to podcasts. But one thing we learned early on was that a super effective way to get people who have never listened to a podcast before was to create the experience for them. So we started what we call listening parties. We launched our first one in October of 2016 in Dubai. It was our coming out party of sorts, even though we'd actually been producing stories for about a year at that point. And we hosted the event at a friend's co-working warehouse in this hip, artsy part of town. Gathered about 150 of our friends and friends of friends. We set up speakers, laid out couches, pillows, and one of our favorite cafes, where I joke Kerning Cultures came into being because of their coffee and brownies, this cafe called Rose Leaf here. They catered, and we played an episode live to the 150 guests. We were not sure how it would be received. Razan, my co-founder, and I were anxious whether people would even listen to the whole episode all the way through, because we're asking them to turn off their phones to pay attention for longer than a few minutes to something they can't even see. In our ADD generation, we really didn't know how everybody would react. For that reason, we picked one of our shortest episodes. It was about 15 minutes long. And it was actually an unusually political episode for us. It was called Mid-East for Trump. And it featured an Iranian American and a Palestinian American who talked about why they were planning to vote for Donald Trump in the pending US presidential election. This was October 2016. And to our complete glee, when we started the episode, no one was looking at their phone. Everybody was staring at the floor, staring up at the ceiling. They were listening intently. And as one listener told us afterwards, it was almost like this meditative experience to be in a group of strangers, all just listening to this story together. It was something nostalgic, like going back to our traditions of oral storytelling. And for us as producers, it was incredible because we could actually see the feedback of our audience. Production is so often a one-way form of communication. You spend months working on something, pouring your heart into it, you publish it out into the world, and sometimes the best reaction you'll get is like a Facebook post or, a comment on Instagram or something. And like this, in a listening party setting, we could actually see where our audience laughed, when they were shocked, what worked for them, what didn't work for them. It was awesome. After the episode, we facilitated a discussion. We passed a mic around, and the conversation went on for over an hour. It was so engaged, and everyone had an opinion about American politics. And for us, we learned that this was a method that worked to create this visceral experience of our show at a podcast listening party, this shared listening experience, and to encourage everyone in the room to subscribe afterwards. Many of whom had never listened to a podcast before now knew at a very positive level what podcasts could do and what listening to them could be like. Since, we've hosted listening parties all over the world, in cities where we have producers, here in Dubai, in London, Seattle in the US, New York, Washington, D.C., California, and Lebanon. And we stopped being so shy about only playing short episodes for fear of attention spans. The longest we've played has been 48 minutes, actually, a 48-minute episode at a listening party, and no one got bored during it. And the discussion afterwards was as animated as it always is. Another trick we learned for helping to grow our audience and awareness around podcasting in general came in our early days when we were still figuring out our voice, learning how to record high quality audio, how to craft compelling, lasting stories. One of the things that worked well for us, we borrowed from a typical lesson of a startup, which is to engage your users in the creative process. Very early on, we encouraged listeners to give us feedback. And I mean real feedback. Friends of friends would send me long voice notes, long emails with bullet points of what they liked, what they didn't like, topics that worked for them, topics that didn't work. And in that way, we were really able to shape our storytelling and production style to fit our actual audience's desires. We continue to engage listener feedback today and invite our listeners to pitch us story ideas that we sincerely read and research and consider, and many of them end up becoming episodes. We actually just launched a new content strategy where our mid-month episode is a listener-inspired story. So for most of our life, we didn't have the bandwidth to release more than one long-form episode a month. Many months we didn't even hit that, to be honest, such as the nature of a startup. And it's only been recently, and with an incredible team, a shout out to Alex Atack and Dana Balut and Bella Ibrahim, that we've started to release twice monthly episodes. And this mid-month episode is a listener-inspired story, like one we recently released that came through an Instagram suggestion featuring a Lebanese cave diver who narrates what plunging into the deepest cave in the world is like. It's terrifying, if you're wondering. And you literally cannot turn the episode off for how intense it is. So in addition to this mid-month strategy, that's really eased our production because these listener-inspired episodes are often shorter form and maybe feature 1 to 2 characters, so they're easier for us to produce. What these listener-inspired stories are doing is also tying our audience more closely to us. So our audience gets to inform the stories they hear on Kerning Cultures, and that's pretty great. As a result, we see more shares and likes and reposts on these episodes. And I liken it to when you call into your favorite radio station and then you actually make it on the air, like you hear yourself on the air. You're going to tell all your friends, right? So that as a marketing strategy has really helped, and we see our subscriber numbers increase because of it. Lastly, and I learned this from a mentor of mine, Mohammed Zaoud. So in the Middle East, video is king. Video is huge. Everyone wants video. The Middle East is one of the fastest growing media markets in the entire world. Digital grows faster here than anywhere else. And we top global usage for Facebook, Snapchat, and YouTube. And the best performing media across those platforms is, of course, video. That's basically what they were built for. So video is very well known here. All brands want their stories in video. All consumers and users spend a lot of time watching videos, predominantly from their phones. So what Mohammed told me was, look, you're building this new medium, this new behavior. You need to convert people into listeners by using a language they already understand. In other words, we need to tease our audio episodes with video. So what we've done, and I have to commend our managing producer, Alex Atack here, who's an extremely talented photographer as well. He creates these short 30-second teasers for each episode. They're almost like film trailers to tease the episodes. So a few days before we release a new episode, we'll drop one of these teasers on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and they tease what the audio episode will be. And they are doing so well. And in that way, we're growing our listening audience by easing people into this new podcast medium that's just audio they probably may not have engaged with before, and through something that they're already familiar with. Now, building a podcast company in a totally unsaturated market also has its advantages. For one, there's little competition, which, is great. But we believe a wave is coming through, and podcasting will take off just as spectacularly in the Middle East as it has in markets like the US, where there were 10 billion podcast downloads last year, and the podcast advertising industry is growing faster than radio and television combined because of how effective podcasts are as a messaging platform. All those trends we expect to match, if not beat, here in the Middle East, and soon. Because there are so few other podcast companies here, and a shout out to some of my favorites like Salt Network in Jordan, The Dukan Show in Dubai, Mustadfir Network in Saudi, it means that we as Kerning Cultures get a lot of press. We've been written up in virtually every publication here in Dubai, which I'm really proud of. And it's because we're unique and novel and one of the few players in this space. This kind of press has been excellent for our team, actually. Most of our team members first heard about us through an article that they read, and then they reached out. So press has been key. The other benefit of playing in a blue ocean as a podcast company in Dubai is that when we started to sell advertisements on our episodes, we could set the price because there were no comps. There's really no other reference point. And we actually earn higher than the typical CPM, or cost per thousand as podcast ads are priced, than our counterparts in a more saturated market like the US. We're also able to charge more here because this is the first time our audience has ever been spoken to like this. This is the first time this kind of content in this format has existed for them. I want to end here with where we see the ecosystem going. We really believe that podcasting will be mainstream very soon across the Middle East and North Africa. There are just so many converging trends that will bring this to pass. We all have access to the technology. The smartphones are physically in our hands, more so here even than elsewhere in the world. We have a long history of the oral tradition in this region, this tradition of gathering around the hekawati, or these oral storytellers who would tell these long form stories in the streets. And bringing that to the digital age is just the natural next step. We're spending more time in our cars with depressingly long commute times. The UAE, Saudi, Egypt, and Bahrain are amongst the top countries with the longest commute times. And spending more time in our cars means we're listening to things while we drive. It's only a matter of time before we start to choose what we want to listen to complement our music or Quran listening. Lastly, we're already seeing crazy numbers when it comes to digital listening behavior in markets like Saudi. Saudis today spend more time listening to digital audio than Americans do. It's predominantly music, but it's only a matter of time before that translates to other audio content like podcasts. The issue right now is there's not enough good quality content when it comes to podcasts. And that's where we and our other Middle East podcast peers come in. So watch this space. Watch this space because we're building an empire. Thank you.
So there we have it. We had a great little 20-25 minute video from Hebah right there, and she covered a lot, and she gracefully sent me some other articles that I just wanted to kind of dive into with the Middle East podcasting scene that's going on. Hebah's going to stay around in the chat room in case you have any more further questions for her or wanted to dive into anything that she shared. And I did want to just highlight, how I actually came into learning about Kerning Cultures. I was searching around for United Arab Emirates based podcasters to invite onto this. And the first episode that I downloaded, and it's one of those where it just sort of left my jaw hanging. It was one where if I was at work, I would have got nothing done because it was just a fascinating story. And it's called Her Side of the Story. And it's the stories of two women reclaiming normal again after divorce and sort of what that means in the Middle East and sort of that journey. And it was a very fascinating episode that I listened to. So make sure you guys head over to kerningcultures.com/episodes. You can find more. And as I dove into it, I was like, this is a excellent production. It's an excellent podcast. It's sharing a narrative and shaping what's going on in the Middle East, North Africa region right now. And and there's a sense of vulnerability. There is a sense of realism when it comes to these. Another one that I found interesting was, 28 years later, Egypt returned to the World Cup. And that was a fascinating journey, hearing about what the country had gone through, what it meant for the population of Egypt. And I do encourage you to head over there. There was another one, none of the above, that I was really fascinated with. The tagline is, "How do you pick an identity when the options don't fit?" And another, just a true, real story of what needs to be shared and what needs to be told, and what Hiba is doing with that, and what Kerning Cultures is doing is purely amazing. So I did want to just run through a couple of these articles that Hiba did provide to us. So for me, I know specifically, and the way this article is written, that our perceptions of the Middle East and North Africa are typically, inadvertently shaped by media coverage, right? We're often The coverage is often drawn upon like stereotypes and appetite for sensationalism. They typically focus on the politics, the violence, um, a lot of the nuance and humanity are often lost in a lot of the coverage. I can say that here, within the United States, it's skewed and it's not particularly drawing on the current state of that. And so that's where Kerning culture fills that gap. As Hibble was quoted in here, we see ourselves at the forefront of a storytelling renaissance, right? Bringing our long history of the oral tradition to the digital age, and she hinted at that in her story or in her presentation. Um, so what Kerning Cultures is doing, it's telling character-driven stories, right, from across, the regions. There's very rich traditions of oral storytelling in the Middle East, and they're bringing that to the forefront. And just to go over some of these other things, as I mentioned, just some of the great stories that are being shared over on their website. And she said, as an Arab, my co-founder had actually not heard of someone vocalizing their hesitations with hijab. It inspired us to produce a two-part series featuring four women's non-narrated stories, and it was, for better or worse, and afterwards. And there is just some rawness to the episodes, and Hiba didn't go into it, but there's a 13-person team. It works remotely from around the world. Yeah, she did mention, there's some in the United States and elsewhere, but it's reaching out to audience, and they're discovering new stories and sharing those new stories. And there's a lot of interest that are growing in that. And, some of these stories are taking 1 to 3 months, right, of research, of interviews, scripting, editing. They're doing sound design, as she had mentioned. And all of this is going into each episode. And the podcast really hones in on the individual experiences, the building blocks of each episode. The team then expands upon them, writing these small narratives, with this academic commentary of what are sort of the broader implications of what's going on there. And so this podcast, obviously it's as she mentioned, generating, revenue from a blend of advertisements, branded content, some sponsorships, syndication, and it's really fascinating to kind of see a really young podcast scene that's going on and how that's being shaped, right? And the beauty of it is you have this very strong storytelling narrative podcast that's shaping the future of Middle Eastern and North African podcasts, and I think that's critical. You do sometimes suffer from whatever's prominent and dominant at the time is going to shape that industry at a time, and this is a really well positioned, great opportunity for Kerning Cultures to really kind of to upend that and steer the course of podcasting and storytelling in the Middle East. And yeah, definitely go over to kerningcultures.com/episodes and just check out what they're offering. There's some really good stuff. I'm subscribed personally to it. It is a really great podcast to go with. And of course, the Arabic podcast, they're finding the growing audience. As Hiba mentioned, there is a high demand for video consumption, and the consumption of radio broadcast is up there. So that's a good caveat, and that's a good avenue that podcasters could get into, you know, and they're becoming more increasingly common in the Arab region. Where there's still perhaps a niche audience. Podcasts produced in the region are offering a largely youthful audience, the chance to listen in on open debates, to hear about sensitive topics, also to learn from experts who are passionate about their careers and research. And it was cited by an individual who's a host, a podcast host in Saudi Arabia, that podcasts are often as act as an inclusive, safe space for people to find out things. And I've never really thought of podcast in that respect, but that's a really good way of framing it. It can be inclusive, it can be a safe place to learn, to educate yourself, to find out about things. And there's a Jordanian based podcast, and they have a polished series on social issues and phenomena surrounded by stigma, tackling topics such as like online dating, bullying, religious conversion, homosexuality, and harassment. And it kind of reminds me of last year we had an individual. Her name was KY. She's from Ghana, and how she was using her podcast to shape sort of the African woman's struggle in the 2017 culture of Ghana, and tackling those topics, sharing those topics, and bringing that to the forefront and putting it in the ears of everybody and empowering so many people out there. And so it's really cool to see. Um, individual by the name of Ramsey Tesdale said that people are starved for really good Arabic content. And I think that's where Kerning culture comes in. It's interesting, it's compelling, and people want to listen to it. There's podcasts. They're a large opportunity, right? You can use podcast as a learning tool, and that's exactly what networks are doing in the UAE and the Middle East, and that's exactly what Hib is doing as well. And you guys, in the chat room, you mentioned about the podcast network that's in Saudi Arabia. Really cool what's happening there. The main program um, has a couple co-hosts. They're getting over 35,000 monthly listeners, and they're originally dedicated to the geek culture. The show has evolved into something more freewheeling, according to this article. So there's a number of things going on there that is truly exciting. Just checking the chat room here to see if there's any questions. Yeah, yeah, everybody, you're more than welcome going truly international with this session. That's the beauty of what we're trying to do here is highlight sort of the nuances, right? First we started with, Hiba not being able to join us live, so we found a workaround. And that was her reaching out to me saying, I still want to be a part of the process. Can I record a segment and still be part of this? And we were definitely on board because as podcasters, we know that there's a lot of workarounds, right? And we don't always have access to a number of services that we want, or maybe there's paywalls involved. So being able to share the story about what's going on in Middle East and North Africa, we're very happy to do so. So let me share another article here, and it's from ArabNews.com. It's "Lend Them Your Ears: Podcast Gain Fans in the Arab World." And, digital media, Hiba mentioned it, big business, right, in the Arab world. Per capita, the region has one of the highest viewing figures in the world for mobile video. They have some of the highest viewing figures, and smartphone use is nearly universal. But of course, one format that has found success in other markets appear to be lagging behind the Middle East is the podcast. And of course, globally, we know in recent years, podcasts have emerged from their niche status and found wider audiences. They're popular amongst a lot of demographics. But there is some data that shows that some of that is a younger listener base. But the design and concept around podcasting is well suited to like deep dive into the topics, right? It's not this traditional radio that's going to give you a couple minutes or highlights of a segment. It's going to provide you with that 35, 45-minute deep dive. But adoption rates, they vary wildly around the world. We know it differs from here in the United States to Brazil to Argentina to Portugal, Australia, New Zealand. It's all over the place, right? So the popularity of podcast in Arab world, it's hard to gauge. There's not very many formal studies that are being commissioned. There's not, say, an Edison research that's out there kind of spanning the landscape to try and figure out some of these things. So the likes of what Hiba are doing with Kerning Cultures is definitely going to set and establish that foundation for some of these metrics moving forward. But there is a trend that's taking root as sort of the theme here. That's sort of echoing a lot of the ways these are being driven, and those are the networks, right, that we mentioned. And to see the future of where podcasting space is going to go in the Middle East and North Africa is very exciting. I know from my perspective and everybody that's out there, it's really cool to see what's going to happen. And let me see. Let me go through a few more of these things. There has been some hiccups along the way. This article reflects, financing is could be a major problem. Audio production is very costly, as we know. For some times, there's grants, maybe there's some other funding mechanisms that they have to rely on. That's what Tesdale said of one of the podcast networks. They get a decent amount of grants, and that's something that I'm not aware of here in the United States. Perhaps there are some nonprofits that are receiving grants for some of their podcasting, but that's a really cool avenue to explore as a funding mechanism. You know, um, according to Tesdale, this year we're 40% supported by services. They're working on bigger contracts. Of course, grants will always be a part of our business model, but we are moving away from that. So, they're starting to sort of shape and form a monetization model out there and trying to get their foothold in that. Of course, Kerning Cultures is mentioned in here, another very successful, as we can tell from this broadcast, narrative-driven show from the region. Of course, this is in English. There's a lot of other podcasts in the native language. There's of course plans to release in the future, and the primary audience, is the region itself, and then there's of course the non-Middle Eastern audience looking to better understand the region, which is where I come in and where I was fascinated with what was going on. And so it's really interesting again to sort of see the framework and the foundation that's being built. It's interesting to see how, as a developing scene, what are the nuances they have to go through to grow. I was fascinated by the listening parties. I have gone to a couple listening parties myself, and they were nowhere near 150 people. There was probably, 15 or 20, maybe 25, but at the same time, it's really cool to be in a place where you have a captive audience, and podcasts have become communal in a sense when you go into listening parties. It's no longer, you know, uh, say you're sedentary on the drive to work or you're sedentary at work, just physically working at your desk. This is the opportunity to build that community relationship and connect with some other individuals. And go back over here. So, that kind of a little bit goes contrary to, how podcasts are so intimate. You're telling someone's story. As Hiba mentioned, sometimes there are individuals that don't want to be, video recorded, and they're perfectly fine sharing their story audio because their story and that concern that they have of, being the face of either a political statement or, some sort of demonstration really holds a lot of people back, right? And so using audio as that tool to reach out to a number of people and to share those stories is quite fascinating in my opinion. I did want to hit on real briefly. Let me check the chat here. Um, any insights on how the U.S. audience sees these international podcasts? Does the accessibility make it easier to tune in, or is the culture still not approachable enough? You know what? I can't obviously speak for the majority of the United States, but it is interesting. I still think that we are still in our bubble, right? Trying to figure out what is our what we have of interest and moving forward. But I know there's a push. I know that's one thing we are doing here at International Podcast Day is to sort of expand your horizons, right? To see some of the international podcasting to find those stories. And I think, you know, very compelling narrative storytelling, narrative driven podcasts are going to do that. That's sort of the content that people are looking for. They're starving for, and having it available in podcast and Google Podcast is definitely helpful. I know just running the International Podcast Day accounts that people are looking for content, not just domestically, but they're looking for it globally. And as long as that content's compelling and it's interesting, I think a lot of people are looking forward to that. So one thing I did want to cover before we get out of here was Hiba mentioned the Middle East Podcast Forum. It's mepodcastforum.com. And they had a really cool agenda that they had. As they said, I think there was 16, 17 different speakers, over 50 different podcasters that were there. And I really like the the model that they had set up. They had a variety of, again, speakers, and they're representing, different podcasts or different networks themselves or media corporations. And they went everything from registration meet and greet and to the kickoff. And they just essentially went down the line of the basic, 101 podcasting things that you need to know. One of their sessions was starting a podcast. Next one was best podcasting techniques, and that was a panel had three panelists and a moderator. And then how monetizing and protecting your IP. That is a very critical component that all podcasters need to know about controlling, their IP and their RSS and really building their brand and being able to protect and monetize off of that. One of the sessions, mastering storytelling, which I think very much goes in line with what Kerning Cultures and some of the produced podcast out there. That's a really good session. That's something that people want to hear about. And then, of course, marketing and growing your audience. It's not just about hitting record. Podcasting is so much more than that. Yes, you're preparing, you're researching, you're interviewing, you're editing, you're in post production, but that's just a portion of it, right? You have to learn how to market it. You need to learn how to connect with your audience, how to focus on growing that audience, so it leads to bigger and better things for yourself. And of course, they had a closing one called podcast ecosystem, sort of the next steps, and so make sure you bookmark mepodcastforum.com. Hibba said that they would be having some videos posted onto their websites in due time. And he was also saying a lot of companies are trying to fix that, instead of the same 50 shows always being there, the only ones people see. So, um, yeah, very interesting. If there's any other questions sort of out there that I can maybe give, some sort of opinion on, or Hibba's still in the chat room joining us, we're happy to share some of that. It says, there are large pockets of Arab immigrants and such in cities in the US. I imagine that the language barrier would not be a big issue. That's a really good point, as um, there are large pockets. There are populations and in communities and cultures that have developed around the immigrant populations, and in such cities across the U.S., you can find them all over the place, and so that is actually another great opportunity for UAE, Middle East, North African podcasters and shows and networks to sort of get around and promote themselves and reach out via social media. Um, yeah, that's a very good point. Let me cruise through here, see what else is on here. Yeah, James Thomas is in the chat room from Four Seas One Family. We had him on last year. It's great to see. Trying to solve issues of discovery with curated list. If you'd like this, we'll make this type of recommendation. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's going to end this session. Hiba, I want to thank you so much for working around the nuance of not being able to have you join live. We appreciate you taking the time to record a 25-minute clip and present yourself, represent yourself, the United Arab Emirates, and of course your podcast. We do want to encourage everybody to head over to kerningcultures.com. And of course, you can find them on Instagram and Twitter. Just search for Kerning Cultures as well. So, with that said, we are going to take a little bit of break here at International Podcast Day. We'll be back at the top of the hour with another session.